Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, Donald Trump failed the first big test of his second administration when Matt Gaetz withdrew from consideration for Attorney General of the United States. Trump's pick for the top job at the Department of Justice made the announcement this afternoon after reportedly learning of a new allegation from the same woman who says she had a sexual encounter with Gaetz when she was a minor. Gaetz was already investigated by the Department of Justice for sex trafficking a minor, allegations he denies. Ultimately, they chose not to bring charges. He has also been the subject of a multi-year investigation by the House Ethics Committee into accusations of sexual misconduct, including sex with a minor, which he denies, as well as illegal drug use. His confirmation was already looking like an uphill battle, with more than a half of Senate Republicans saying they did not expect Gaetz to get the necessary votes. And Trump wasted no time choosing his replacement. Tonight, he announced he will nominate Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. Bondi is a longtime Trump ally, representing the then president during his first impeachment trial. He liked to put his own lawyers in the Department of Justice, apparently. She's also a Fox News regular, even co-hosting an afternoon program while she was still serving as Florida's top lawyer. So we'll have to wait and see how Trump's second choice for Attorney General fares. But this is important. He decisively lost his first fight, and it was with his own party. And in doing so, he proved that political gravity still exists. Donald Trump may have won more votes in swing states. He did. Eke out a plurality nationally. He did. That did not suddenly make him a brilliant tactician. And it did not convert the band of miscreants around him into popular and confirmable figures. Choosing Matt Gaetz for this job was a dumb move. It was an unforced error. He is manifestly unqualified and, as we learned, unconfirmable. Of course, he's just the first. The president-elect has chosen a menagerie of figures for his cabinet, many of whom also face very serious accusations. There's Pete Hegseth, who is accused of sexually assaulting a woman at a conservative conference in 2017. He denies the allegation. He says the sex was consensual. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., accused of sexually assaulting his 23-year-old babysitter. He's not exactly denied these allegations, though he has said he is, quote, not a church boy. There's Linda McMahon, sued for allegedly enabling child abuse. She's called that lawsuit baseless. If gravity truly does exist on this planet, those are the sorts of things that would sink any presidential nominee. In fact, a lot of people have gone down for far, far less. I mean, the first major one of the modern era was Zoe Baird, Bill Clinton's first pick for that same job, for Attorney General in 1993. And the week before Clinton's inauguration, a front-page New York Times story broke the bombshell report that Baird had paid an undocumented nanny off the books.
Bill Clinton's cabinet choices have been sailing through the confirmation process, but now there are questions about Zoe Baird. That's his choice for Attorney General, the nation's chief law enforcement officer. She may have broken the law.
Baird employed a Peruvian couple in this country illegally for almost 2 years. One is a babysitter, the other is a driver. In addition to violating immigration laws, Baird and her husband also failed to pay their employees Social Security taxes.
Within a matter of days, Nannygate, seriously, as it came to be known, had blown up enough to destroy Baird's nomination.
The White House insists that Zoe Baird made the decision to withdraw, but there's plenty of evidence that she was pushed.
Discharged.
The Clinton cabinet, minus Zoe Baird, was sworn in this morning. At their first cabinet meeting, the president said he was sad about Baird's decision.
I feel very badly about it, but I'm responsible for it, and I'm going to start this afternoon looking for an attorney general.
Unfortunately for Clinton, his woes continue with his next nominee for AG, if you believe it, Judge Kimba Wood, who, guess what, also had a nanny problem, as well as a brief stint training as a Playboy bunny.
More than 3 months after his election, Bill Clinton is still looking for an attorney general tonight, now for the third time.
The White House tried to change the subject today, but instead had to work overtime trying to clean up the attorney general mess.
Clinton dumped Judge Kimba Wood as a prospective nominee for attorney general, even though she had paid all taxes on an undocumented nanny.
So she'd paid the taxes, unlike the first one, still didn't make it. Now, yes, if you're going to be attorney general of the United States, you should probably follow the law scrupulously. But I guess I feel with today's hindsight and perspective, these are pretty minor offenses, already resolved by paying back the relatively small amounts of money owed. However, the trend continued in a bipartisan fashion into the George W. Bush administration.
Linda Chavez today withdrew as the nominee for Secretary of Labor after 2 hard days of stories about an illegal immigrant who lived with her, performing some work for cash back in 1991 through 1993. When Chavez was initially interviewed by the Bush team, she didn't tell them about the immigrant, Marta Mercado, a Guatemalan.
Same went for former New York City Police Commissioner Bernie Kerik in 2004.
Bernard Kerik, the man so many Americans remember from 9/11 in New York, was nominated by the president for a big cabinet-ranked job to run the Department of Homeland Security. That is, until it fell apart in spectacular fashion late Friday night.
In today's Daily News, a report of not one but 2 messy extramarital affairs, one with the famous publisher of his autobiography, Judith Regan. Kerik admitted the relationships, adding,
I think that's my personal business. That's their business, and I think it should stay at that.
Kerik had said it was only his nanny problem that cost him the job, but there were other issues even beyond his affairs. They include a past lawsuit for unpaid condominium fees that led to an arrest warrant for Kerik, a document Newsweek faxed to the White House Friday night, and a past bankruptcy, according to the website The Smoking Gun.
Now, you might sense a theme here, which is America's strange relationship to immigration, in which people seem to depend a lot on the labor of immigrants, undocumented immigrants, but want to pretend those people don't exist. But perhaps the most nonsensical flops came at the beginning of the Obama administration. That's when Nancy Killefer lost a job over less than a $1,000 tax bill, really. And Tom Daschle was bumped because of the free car rides he got from a wealthy friend.
The day started when the president's nominee for the new job of chief performance officer pulled out because of a reported problem with $900 in back taxes. Then came the other shoe, the big one, the man who was supposed to tackle health care, Tom Daschle.
And I deeply apologize.
Took himself out of the running for Secretary of Health and Human Services. For the former Senate Majority Leader, it's an enormous fall from grace. The man from South Dakota who bragged in a campaign commercial years ago that he still drove his old broken-down car was caught not paying taxes on the use of a chauffeur-driven car that he used to get around Washington for the past few years.
So a rich guy loans Daschle his car to get around. Daschle never reports that as income and therefore doesn't pay taxes on the imputed income of the value of the car. Again, I think it looks pretty quaint in comparison to people like Pete Hegseth, RFK Jr., and Matt Gaetz. And now, it's undeniably good news that Matt Gaetz will not be our next attorney general. But today's outcome does not relieve the pressure on Trump's other picks. In fact, Republicans in the Senate, again, to their credit, have made it clear they are not willing to publicly humiliate themselves in the most abject fashion imaginable for Donald Trump's wildly unqualified and unpopular choices. The fight is far from over.
While Matt Gaetz will not be leading the Justice Department, that doesn't mean that the issue of sexual abuse has somehow vanished. It remains a very fundamental component of the individuals selected to work with Donald Trump, who himself has been credibly accused by nearly 24 women and found liable for sexual abuse. As Slate points out, if everyone is a sexual predator, then no one's history of misdeeds matters, or at least no one needs to be held accountable. Being accused of sexual harassment, abuse, or assault is no longer disqualifying. On the right, it has been normalized. It may even be an asset. As it stands, there are 3 cabinet picks who have been credibly accused of sexual misconduct. Let's start with Pete Hegseth, Trump's pick for Secretary of Defense. Last night, the Monterey Police Department released a 22-page police report in response to a public records request related to sexual assault. According to the report, a woman told police that Hegseth sexually assaulted her in a hotel room after he took her phone, blocked the exit from the hotel room, and refused to let her leave. Hegseth told police at the time that the encounter had been consensual and denied any wrongdoing. The woman helped organize the event at which Hegseth spoke. She told police that she had witnessed Hegseth acting inappropriately toward women and saw him rubbing their thighs. She texted a friend that Hegseth was giving off a creeper vibe, according to the report. Hegseth's lawyer responded to the report, claiming that the police report confirms that the incident was fully investigated and police found the allegation to be false. which is why no charges were filed. The police did not find the allegations to be false. In fact, they recommended that the case report be sent to the Monterey County DA's office for review. In 2023, Hegseth paid the woman to sign a non-disclosure agreement, a common tool to silence victims of sexual abuse. Let's move on to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a serial philanderer who would rate his sexual conquests in his diary. In July, his children's nanny, who was 23 at the time, told Vanity Fair that Kennedy sexually assaulted her by grabbing her breasts without her consent. He reportedly texted an apology to the nanny and seemingly acknowledged the incident when he was asked about it, saying, "I am not a church boy. I have so many skeletons in my closet." He later added, "I am who I am." And then there was Linda McMahon, who, along with her husband, Vince, is being sued for fostering a culture of sexual abuse within the WWE because they ignored alleged abuse committed by a ringside announcer who sexually assaulted 13 to 15-year-old boys. Claims they deny. Joining me now is Frank Figliuzzi, former assistant FBI director for counterintelligence and MSNBC senior national security analyst, and Molly Jong-Fast, Vanity Fair special correspondent and MSNBC contributor. Thank you both for being here. I do want to start with you here at the table, Molly, because it seems that this is a pattern. You could add Elon Musk, who has faced allegations that there was a sort of an atmosphere of sexual harassment at Tesla. And you could add the now former AG pick, Matt Gaetz. It just feels like Donald Trump is cultivating people around him. He nominated Brett Kavanaugh, who was also credibly accused and also denied those claims. 2/3 of the conservative majority on the Supreme Court have had such allegations, if you count Clarence Thomas. There's something happening with Republicans where all the things that QAnon claimed were true, right? They were saying that that was true about Democrats, but here we are. What does this say to women?
Yes, well, that's a really good point. And I think, look, these people are in the highest levels of the law. Like Attorney General, you are setting the law and on the federal level. And then you have someone who has numerous allegations and Venmo. And I think what's the most interesting in a weird way is it seems clear at some point Trump realized that this was never going to go through anyway, because he had somebody else all teed up.
He had a woman all teed up. I think it's very clear that it was very deliberate. He's looking for another Florida person, this time a woman.
Right. And I think ultimately, look, it's modeling a kind of bad behavior. And we talked about this before, that part of Trumpism is giving this permission that you don't have to care about people, right? That you can kind of do whatever you want. That owning
your
the
body,
libs,
my choice.
Right, exactly. And you're owning the libs is sort of a central tenet of this kind of governance. Not so much about governance, but about giving these kind of people permission to do what they wanted to do all along.
Yeah. And Frank, can we talk about, from a law enforcement point of view, you know, the Pete Hegseth side are trying to say that because there was not a prosecution, that means the police report exonerates him. That is not what that police report does. I read that police report earlier today in horror. It was horrifying. He definitely denied it to the police as well. That's in the report. But when you have allegations like that from a witness, an alleged victim, is it possible to claim that one is exonerated simply because no charges were immediately filed?
Short answer, no. This question comes up over and over again in a myriad of ways. And the answer is that the ending of an investigation, the decision to decline prosecution, is not an exoneration, but rather a decision that involves all kinds of variables like, look, everybody was drunk. We don't know how this is going to play in front of a jury. A check has been written to settle this, and we're kind of okay with that. Memories have failed. It's, you know, all of that plays into, and the degree to which a particular district attorney says, I have to be 100% certain before I go to trial. Some say I'll take 90% certainty. So no, not an exoneration. Let's also add the well-reported issues throughout the Pentagon and the U.S. military with the issue of sex assault. And we finally have made progress in how the military handles allegations like that, wresting control of that decision-making away from commanders on base and letting other sets of eyes look at and adjudicate those allegations. So someone like Hegseth would instill fear in all members of the military about whether or not anyone's going to ever believe them again regarding sexual assault. And I've got to add real quick, we're having this conversation, Joy, about everybody's backgrounds being a mess because Trump is avoiding FBI background investigations. Yes. He's not submitting his nominees' names for review. So, you talk about abnormal becoming normal. It's true not only with sexual allegations across everybody, but also with the fact he's blowing off the FBI background investigations that have been done since Dwight Eisenhower.
Thank you for pointing that out, because had there been FBI there was also this allegation, Frank, that there was the FBI background investigation into the Kavanaugh situation that was scuttled by the White House. So they're absolutely not allowing the FBI to do its job. And now they're also talking about putting a loyalist, someone like a Kash Patel, in that job. So then an FBI background investigation might not even mean anything at that point.
Yeah, real concerned about the lack of insights that the Senate Judiciary is really going to have. They're flying blind without FBI background investigations. And the silly notion that Trump's using a private firm to do those backgrounds, guess what? They're loyal to whoever's paying their invoice.
The International Criminal Court has just issued an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes. The ICC also issuing warrants for Israel's former defense minister and the military chief of Hamas. Let's go right to NBC correspondent Raf Sanchez in Tel Aviv. Raf, walk us through these allegations in the arrest warrants and what reaction we've seen from Netanyahu.
So, Anna, this is a real bombshell from the International Criminal Court, the ICC. They are saying that having studied the evidence presented to them by prosecutors, there are reasonable grounds to believe that both Netanyahu and Israel's former defense minister Yoav Gallant committed war crimes in Gaza. Specifically, they are accusing these two leaders of using starvation as a weapon of war by blocking humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. And they are saying that in some cases, Israel deliberately attacked Palestinian civilians inside of Gaza. So this means Netanyahu is now in a lonely club, along with Vladimir Putin, of major world leaders who are wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Netanyahu is denouncing this, as he is calling it, an anti-Semitic decision by a corrupt prosecutor, by biased judges. I want to read you just a little bit of a statement that his office put out earlier today. They say no anti-Israel resolution will prevent the state of Israel from protecting its citizens. Prime Minister Netanyahu will not give in to pressure, will not flinch, and will not withdraw until all the war goals set by Israel at the start of the campaign are achieved. Practically, Anna, it is very unlikely that we are going to see Netanyahu in handcuffs in the dock at the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands anytime soon. But this does mean that Netanyahu may not be able to travel to countries that are signed up to the ICC. So that is the UK, France, Germany, all of Western Europe. He could still travel to the United States. We are hearing from the White House. They are saying that they fundamentally reject this decision by the ICC to move ahead with arrest warrants. We're likely to hear something similar from the Republican side. Some Republican senators have talked about sanctioning the chief prosecutor if he moved ahead with these warrants. But this is a major, major moment in this year-long plus war.
Breaking news on Capitol Hill this morning, where both FBI Director Christopher Wray and the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas are apparently refusing to appear before a Senate committee this morning. That hearing had been planned for months, but this is an 11th hour back out. In a statement, the chair of the committee, Democrat Gary Peters, saying, quote, for the first time in more than 15 years, the Homeland Security Secretary and the FBI Director have refused to appear before the committee. Their choice to not provide public testimony about their department's efforts to address wide-ranging national security threats robs the American people of critical information and the opportunity for public accountability. Let's get over to NBC's Ken Delaney for more on what's going on here. So, Ken, Senator Peters says this is a, quote, shocking departure from tradition. Is it?
It is fairly shocking, Anna, in part because this hearing had been planned for weeks, and it was only on Monday that these two top officials decided that they weren't going to testify in public, and they did so both in the House version of this hearing and the Senate version. And it's pretty clear what's going on here. These two men are not expected to continue for very much longer in their jobs, and these congressional hearings are very unpleasant for them. They get grilled by members of both parties on all sorts of issues. They even get death threats in some cases after these hearings. And so they're choosing not to appear in public. Now, the FBI is saying in a statement to us that they have provided lots of information in public settings over the last year about all kinds of threats, and that's true. But you know, this was a chance for the taxpayers to hear from these people who work for them about significant threats facing the nation, and they're not going to get that chance on it.
Mr. Mayorkas, he was a Biden appointee. He will leave his post when the next Trump administration begins. We know Governor Kristi Noem has been tapped to be Donald Trump's nominee for that position. Trump himself appointed Director Wray, though. So it's interesting that they seem to not see eye to eye anymore. You've been reporting he's on the outs. What has Wray done or not done that has Trump so unhappy with him?
Yes, well, clearly Donald Trump has been savaging the FBI for several years, calling it corrupt and unethical, and a lot of it relates to FBI involvement on those two special counsel investigations, and then which resulted in indictments of Donald Trump. And of course, Christopher Wray signed off on the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, which Donald Trump has denounced. Now, it's interesting, you know, he did hire Chris Wray, and for a long time during the Trump administration, Wray managed to survive and navigate these choppy waters. But it does seem like, from everything we know, that Donald Trump wants to bring in somebody who's going to take the FBI in a much different direction. Now, the potential options, it's a pretty wide range between a figure like Kash Patel, who is a MAGA bomb thrower, rhetorical bomb thrower, and a figure like Mike Rogers of Michigan, who's a former FBI agent, former Army officer, headed the House Intelligence Committee, a much more mainstream pick. So it remains to be seen exactly what Donald Trump does here. But from everything we can tell, it does seem like Chris Wray will not serve out his 10-year term.
We are all back, and joining our conversation is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island. He is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, I apologize for the seediness of today's lead story, the subject of Matt Gaetz. But do you feel, I feel sort of a combination, a weird combination specific to the time of Trump, of relief and deep anxiety about, like, what was in the box that Matt Gaetz's name came out of, right? Like, there was obviously a hat out which came names like Todd Blanche and Mr. Clayton and people who were normal enough. And then there was another hat, and the name Matt Gaetz came out of that hat. What do you think is behind Matt Gaetz?
It's very hard to tell. Certainly nothing that's very sane or normal. I think when you want to install as the chief prosecutor of the United States of America somebody whose only experience with criminal investigations is to be the subject of one, you have really departed from the most fundamental guardrails of normalcy. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and God bless them, sufficient Republican senators sent the message back to the White House that this can't fly, that they ended up withdrawing. I think, you know, a piece of this has been a challenge to the Republican senators by the Trump administration, sort of daring them. There's the legend of the foreign potentate who had the door to his reception chamber built 2 feet high, so everybody had to come in a crawl. This was kind of a crawl test for Republican senators to have to eat awful nominees like Gaetz and Gabbard. And so, you know, the crawl test continues, but it's kind of reassuring that enough Republican senators were willing to be part of the stand-up cohort and not the crawl cohort. And I hope that continues for some of these other appalling nominees.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting observation because in the time of Trump, there is a sort of rinse and repeat dynamic. Trump is appalling. they avoid our cameras for 36 hours, and then, that's what the people want. I wonder if you think it's worth wondering whether strength can be a cycle as well, whether drawing a line could get more lines being drawn with people like Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah, I think that the Trump administration took a surprisingly strong hit here. Think of the past 48 hours with J.D. Vance, our senator's colleague and soon-to-be vice president, bringing people into his office with Matt Gaetz for come to Jesus sessions to try to pressure them into signing up for a completely unpalatable candidate. And then immediately thereafter, he's withdrawn. Yeah. So the kind of atmosphere of threat and intimidation and pressure and inevitability has been shattered already. And I suspect there's a bit of resentment brewing from those personal conversations. And now that it's been shown that it didn't work, then, so much the better. So to all my Republican colleagues who stood up and made it clear to the White House that this wasn't going to happen, bravo them.
It's important, right, to call that out when it does happen. Even though it's rare, it doesn't diminish the fact that at a moment when a lot of the narrative, I'm not sure that it's deserved, is about Trump's political strength, they, when it came to Matt Gaetz, found their spines. I want to read you, to your point about the meetings that J.D. Vance is orchestrating, this was the pitch for Matt Gaetz. This is reporting in the Bulwark. So this is what Matt Gaetz said to senators, quote, "Look, I'm not going to go there and indict Liz Cheney, have stormtroopers bust through the studio door at MSNBC and arrest Anthony Fauci in my first week," Gaetz told some senators in his one-on-one meetings, according to two people familiar with them. It's that last clause, quote, "in my first week," that sounded like an ominous disclaimer to some, and it prompted a few senators to ask with a laugh, what happens thereafter? To which he said, quote, "We're not doing that." Donald Trump's AG nominee then said, quote, "We're breaking the cycle of weaponizing DOJ." I guess the problem with that is that men like Bill Barr had a hard time stopping Donald Trump's desire to use the IRS and use the Department of Justice against Trump's enemies, that Trump was relentless in this request. And do you think that it is a prerequisite for whoever replaces Matt Gaetz atop the Department of Justice that they be willing to do retribution as it's been short-termed?
It would not surprise me, but can we start with the beginning big lie in all of this, which is the question of whether DOJ was weaponized? The question of DOJ being weaponized, and for instance, New York prosecutors and Georgia prosecutors all being part of some weaponization thing, is simply the counter narrative to the fact of the matter, which is that Trump is a criminal. And who got caught and had to do all sorts of wheedling and weaseling to get out of it where he could, and in other places was either found guilty or found liable. So, behind all of this is an effort to scrub out the underlying fact that the guy that they're supporting, the head of this cult, is in fact a criminal. And when you can't admit that, you've got to go after the prosecutors, and then you get into this cascade of rhetorical consequence that opens up the door for turning that office into the actual weapon that you're pretending it was against Trump.
It's not a lot of sort of hops on the Candyland board game to get from Trump's reelection to Matt Gaetz as the first failed pick to head DOJ to the Supreme Court's granting of absolute immunity for official acts. Where are your sort of worst case scenario concerns these days?
I think the immediate worst case scenario concern would have to do with an abuse of the try to get around advice and consent by adjourning the Senate and then using the recess appointments clause. That ought to be a slam dunk, obvious violation of the Constitution. But I thought presidential immunity was a slam dunk, obvious violation of the Constitution, where, I mean, the Constitution provides for limited legislative immunity, no presidential immunity. So the idea that you read into that a more robust presidential immunity makes no constitutional sense, but they did it. But I really think the spooky thing would be if they allowed more people like Matt Gaetz to get appointed by knocking down the advice and consent process that stopped him.
NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is covering the Trump transition. Eddie Glaude is back with us as well. So, Vaughn, I think more than 1 million federal employees could be impacted by this. What more do we know about how Musk and Ramaswamy plan to execute these plans?
Right. Vivek Ramaswamy has openly said that if the federal government were to require all of its workforce to come into the office 5 days a week, they would effectively be able to eliminate 25% of the federal workforce. That was the prediction of Vivek Ramaswamy. Donald Trump has installed Elon Musk and Ramaswamy into outside the government consultancy roles to oversee this Department of Government Efficiency, as they're calling it, in order to provide what there would be recommendations to downsize the workforce for departments and agencies. Now, both of them are making the case that much of this can be done unilaterally by effectively forcing the hand of federal workers to comply with the regulations and decisions by the Trump administration, and that there will be a natural purging of the federal workforce. But also, much of this would come down to the reclassification of part of the federal workforce from civil workers, career workers, into political appointees. That could be one way. Donald Trump could sign that executive order to do just that. That would be another way to potentially eliminate tens of thousands of jobs. But then there is also the potential of congressional authorization to enact and give the president, elect Trump, the authority to consolidate some of these departments and agencies and downsize the workforce through congressional authorization under the Presidential Reorganization Act. And this is notable because just this morning, Marjorie Taylor Greene was announced to head up a new subcommittee in the U.S. House that is an extension of this Department of Governmental Efficiency. So they clearly have the interest of actually going through and using the executive office to cut back this workforce and reduce it, but also use Capitol Hill as a means of identifying where they can consolidate and make those cuts.
So look, Eddie, the federal government is not alone in making decisions about return to work, for sure, right? But I'd like to get your take on the tone of this op-ed toward government workers. I mean, did you hear an insinuation that they are the problem, along with their promise to cut regulations, which some people have argued has less to do with saving the government money and more to do with businesses making money? I wonder what you heard when you read this op-ed.
So a couple of things, Chris. One is it's ironic that you have these oligarchs who are going to implement Donald Trump's so-called populist vision. Gives you a sense of how ironic that is. But two, there's this sense when Donald Trump talks about the enemy within, he's not just talking about Democrats. He's talking about the deep state, those bureaucracies, those agencies that gum up his attempt to have the U.S. Move at his will. And so this is part of this ongoing effort to address shall we say, the size of the federal government, these bureaucracies that aren't elected. Here in the op-ed, they hearken back to this wasn't a conception of the government that the founders had. Of course not. The founders, there were 13 colonies. Right? It was an agrarian society, an agrarian slaveholding society. Of course, they didn't think about the size of American society today. So what I see and hear, right, is the actual execution of not just simply an agenda to promote a small government, but an agenda to break government, and that will have enormous ramifications for the very constituency that put them in office. I keep asking myself, Chris, what have these people done? What have they done?
Worked hard. Well, they're saying they're going to save money. Can we talk about the monetization of government positions? Donald Trump just unveiled his latest venture with a photo on Truth Social. He's holding what he calls a limited edition 45 guitar. Some personally signed. They cost up to $10,000. That's just one example. Melania Trump is selling online photos of her life. Trump's pick for HHS, RFK, once that was announced. He's using that for fundraising. Should we be worried about all of that?
Hell yes. He's an expert level grifter. And you know what's really got me? Representative Summer Lee said this in the House of Representatives the other day. You know, a person like me, they complain that I'm a DEI hire. A person like Kamala Harris, she was nominated only because she was a black woman. Ketanji Brown Jackson, DEI, no merit based. Look at this. Are these folk in their positions because of merit? Of course not. So it's just unadulterated grift with no sense, no moral sense at all. And to me, it's a low moment in the history of the country. Can you imagine? Donald Trump will be the president of the United States on the 250th anniversary of the nation. My God, where have we come?
I'll let that.
Welcome back. One of Donald Trump's longtime allies is publicly speaking out against the president-elect's plan to use the military as part of a mass deportation operation targeting undocumented immigrants. Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky expressed his opposition to the plan yesterday in an interview he gave on a cable show.
I'm not in favor of sending the Army in uniforms into our cities to collect people. I think it's a terrible image, and that's not what we use our military for. We never have, and it's actually been illegal for over 100 years to bring the Army into our city. So while I'm all for remain in Mexico, I will not support an emergency to put the Army into our cities. I think that's a huge mistake.
Joining us now, former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro. He is an MSNBC political analyst. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us this morning. You've certainly been an outspoken critic of Trump's mass deportation plan. Let's zero in on that angle of it. The idea of, first of all, a Republican speaking out against, but secondly, that image of using the American military to do this.
Well, a couple of things here. I think this is just a preview of some of the problems that Trump is going to have if he actually tries to go through with his mass deportation plan. Rand Paul makes a very good point. This is not what we use the military for, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are other Republicans who agree with him there. Secondly, I think this issue of mass deportation, as much as it was polled before the election and you had some support among the public, the difference between that in theory and Americans actually seeing that in living color on their TV, on streaming, and every way that we get our visual images these days, I think that public opinion would very quickly go against this kind of plan.
Well, that's the idea. I've heard so many Democrats say exactly that. This idea that's pulling your neighbors out of their homes, children out of school, that will look very different than just sort of a vague promise on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I think it's easy for people when they're answering a polling question, if you just ask them impromptu, should everybody get deported who's not here legally in the country, But when you see the effect of that and people realize that it's not just somebody that came across yesterday that's seeking asylum, it's somebody that has been doing their yard work or, goes to the same church or their kids go to the same school. It's much more deep and personal than that. And I think folks are going to recognize that if Trump actually tries this. And I think that it's going to be dead on arrival if he tries it.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly very personal reasons, as you just said, but there are also economic reasons. I know you've voiced some concerns. How would you see, were he to carry out this plan, what does that do to the nation's economy?
I mean, this would decimate the American economy. There are a number of industries that are absolutely reliant on undocumented immigrants, whether people like that or not. Those are just the facts. Whether you're talking about the construction industry, the agricultural industry, meat packing, any number of other industries. Hospitality is another one. And so as Americans, I don't think that we've fully grappled with the reality of what undocumented immigrants mean to the United States, what they produce for our economy, how reliant we are. And again, people can like that or not like that, but those are the facts. And Donald Trump coming in, trying to do mass deportation would not only be, I think, personally, humanly cruel, but also would decimate the American economy.
And there's certainly a theory out there that some business leaders might warn Trump, that could happen. We know how much Trump cares about their approval and potentially the stock market. But setting that aside, were he to just continue to forge forward with this plan, what do you see, if anything, that, Democratic or Republican, whether it's mayors or governors, local officials, is there anything that can be done to sort of stand in the way?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of pushback. And look, there's a blueprint for that pushback that we saw during the first Trump administration and that we've seen before. For instance, in years before, police chiefs across the United States have objected to local police being turned into immigration agents because they say, hey, this would actually make us less safe. People are less willing to report crime, less willing to interact with public safety officials because they fear that they might get entangled in a deportation scheme, and that means everybody is less safe. So I think there, obviously, legal protection. The ACLU has already filed a lawsuit against the federal government seeking more information about how this would be done. You're going to see a lot of pushback to this.
So let's turn to some of the other matters right now during the presidential transition. And you just, as you sat down, you raised, I think, something important that we've talked a little bit about on the show, this idea of the vetting process and the lack of FBI background checks.
That's right. Trump, seems to want to go around the usual process, and instead of using the FBI for background checks, use some private service, or who knows, maybe not even do any background checks in the first place. There's a question as to whether he can do that, but one of the reasons that I think he may be trying to do that is to avoid his nominees getting into problems with the law by lying to the FBI. We have seen a number of instances of that in his administration, in past administrations. And so this may be one way, with all of the baggage that we know that several of these nominees have, of trying to avoid criminal charges coming down the pike later. That hasn't been mentioned much, but that's a real concern for those folks that he's put up and that may have issues where they would be tempted to lie to the FBI, and you're on the hook criminally in a way that you're not if you're talking to some private agency that doesn't have the same authority.
That criminal liability, a great point. It also seems like the vetting process they've used, as we've seen for some of these nominees, has already missed some pretty damaging material. We really appreciate former Secretary Julian Castro for joining us this morning. We hope you'll come back soon.